All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to get us started. So, welcome. Good morning. Welcome to the Child Abuse Prevention Council's speaker series. We are so excited to be here with all of you during Child Abuse Prevention Month. I am James Gibbon Shapiro, and I'm honored to have worked with Peg Cathcart, Steve Barron, Annie Liu, and Julie McKellar in organizing this series of speakers for you. Thank you, Child Abuse Prevention Council, for presenting this speaker series at a time when we can't meet in person, and for underwriting all the costs so that the series is free to all attendees. We have more than 420 people registered for today's event, and thank you all for coming to this morning. We are at an important moment in our county and in America, where we are examining and re-examining how all of us as professionals who work to serve children can do our jobs better, can serve kids better, by thinking about the racial, ethnic, immigration, gender identity, and other issues that need that examination and may not have gotten it enough. The speaker series today and Friday of next week seeks to talk about the things that are hard to talk about, and to think about them in new ways. The ideas presented in the series are from presenters that will challenge us to stretch the way we think about issues of disproportionality in our systems, and may even make us a bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. Hearing about race and immigration issues, as we're going to be doing this morning, is something that's not always comfortable. But this series, we're not trying to restate for you ideas and practices that are comfortable, but to have us spend some time hearing about some ideas that push us to think about this work in different ways. I want to talk about a few housekeeping things before we begin in earnest. So first, at the end of each session, there's going to be a question and answer period, and here's how it's going to work. Type your question in the Q&A feature for this webinar. You'll see a button for it near the bottom of your screen, and I see some of you have already done that, so thank you for doing that. When you type a question, I will see it, but the rest of the attendees won't see it, and I'll ask as many of them as I can of our speakers during the Q&A portion. You can type your questions now, during the presentation, or after, but they're going to get asked during that Q&A part by me. Second, we're going to have a 10-minute break between our first presentation and the second, so that you can get a cup of coffee or take care of anything. So between this presentation with our first two speakers and the presentation with our next two speakers, there's going to be a 10-minute break between those two things. Third, we're going to be sending continuing education credit certificates by email in a few weeks, so look for those in your inbox. And lastly, you're going to get an email after the speaker series asking for feedback. And we hope that you fill it out so that we can learn from our experience doing this and doing it this way. Now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Barron to introduce our first two speakers. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up. Let me just mention again the title of this particular workshop. It's Disproportionality and Racial Bias in Child Welfare, Research, Manifestations, Controversies, and Recommendations. And now I'm going to introduce each of our two presenters who we're thrilled really to have here, both experts in their fields. First of all, and who will be presenting first, Dr. Darcey Merritt, who is an associate professor at New York University Silver and is a faculty fellow for the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, internationally recognized and consulted for her expertise in child welfare. She also serves on the Child Maltreatment Prevention Committee of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and was lead author of the chapter on Effective Program Models for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment in the APSAC Handbook on Child Maltreatment, 4th edition. She is on the boards of directors of the Society for Social Work and Research and the Child Welfare League of America. She is co-editor-in-chief of Children and Youth Services Review and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Child Maltreatment. Dr. Merritt's research has been widely published in numerous journals and primarily focuses on child welfare-involved families and their perceived lived experiences while receiving services, particularly Black and Latinx families, on neighborhood and the psychosocial indicators of well-being outcomes, the structural and systemic impact of child welfare oversight on parenting, children's preferences and expectations for permanency while living in out-of-home placements, and child developmental and well-being outcomes in the context of socio-behavioral, relational, and neighborhood factors. Dr. Brett Drake has been a professor at the George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis since 1991. Much of his work utilizes big data to advance front-end child maltreatment epidemiology, service provision, and policy, with a particular emphasis on race, ethnicity, disproportionality, and poverty. Dr. Drake researches matters of child welfare with a focus on the connections between socio-environmental conditions and child neglect and early interventions. His current research analyzes census and child protective data to assess the efficacy of protective and preventative services. He also consults with a number of state and local agencies regarding evaluation and administrative data. Along with his wife, Melissa Johnson Reed, he is the author of the recent book, After the Cradle Falls: What Child Abuse Is, How We Respond to It, and What You Can Do About It, published by Oxford. We're going to start off with Dr. Merritt. Dr. Merritt, welcome. Thank you for showing up also.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. And that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. I can't add much more other than to say that I have roots in California. So I have over 10 years experience as a child welfare practitioner in private and public child welfare agencies in Los Angeles area. Even though I'm in New York now, my formative experience comes from the Best Coast, I like to call it. So I think I'll get started and share my screen. And let's see. It wouldn't be right if everything went easily, right? Okay, here we are. Can everybody see my screen now? Yes, okay, wonderful. So
yes, now I can see it.
Okay, fantastic. So this is the title of my my little talk today. Why Black people catch ACS cases more than white people. And I'll tell you that the phrase catch ACS cases comes directly from the respondents that I've interviewed for a few of my pilot studies. And it just strikes me so much because this is a term that one generally hears with folks that are interacting with the criminal justice system. I caught a case, but apparently it's language that's used very commonly, not just among the families and parents, but also among the caseworkers and clinicians that I've interviewed. And it strikes me, and I just want to point that out, that people feel like they catch a case. And so we just should ponder about that. And Black people use that language more often than white folks involved in the child welfare system. So to begin, I'm just going to say systemic racism extends to specific involvement with systemically racist organizations and or exposure to contexts that are characterized by racist experiences. So we need to consider the notion of racism inherent in how we assess, evaluate, and conduct our research. As an example, we need to think about why we generally use white children and parents as the normative comparison group. So think about that as we go on through my presentation and also through Dr. Drake's presentation. So of note, and with regard to Santa Clara County, which was characterized as a diverse community, given the county population breakdown and trends, noting that the Black population is very small and slowly declining, the white population continuing to steadily decline and being replaced by a rapidly increasing Asian and Pacific Islander population and a slowly increasing Latino population, my research unfortunately doesn't capture the nuances of child welfare involvement among the AAPI community. The current ranking in this population is from high to low is AAPI, white, Latino, and then a very small sample of Black people. So in terms of racial disproportionality in Santa Clara County, we should consider those numbers as well. So not only is racism a problem, but a lot of people fail to understand the problem of colorism. Colorism is a huge problem, and we consider that a form of street race. Whatever race you show up on the street as exhibiting, that's generally how you will ultimately be interpreted and treated. So these problems, colorism and our implicit biases, have played a role in how we've arrived at opinions regarding all of the different populations and communities that we serve. So these are the objectives that I hope to achieve in my talk. All right, the United States has a very storied history of discrimination, which continues to manifest. We see it every day in structurally oppressive systems, including many of our social and human service agencies. Structurally racist and oppressive societal and environmental contexts are usually the backdrop with which all systems are underpinned. Institutional racism is often quite subtle, and for the most part, it has been unheeded by child welfare scholars, particularly regarding Black families. So what I'm suggesting here is the notion that inherent race-based inequities are systematically supported and perpetuated in all aspects of child welfare processes. Lived experiences are extremely important to consider. Perceptions of racism amidst systems involvement are directly related to being among those with lower socioeconomic status and a resulting inability to thrive and flourish in our society. There's been a great deal of debate regarding the primary causes of racial and ethnic disproportionality and at what point in this child welfare process that this manifests. And the CWS is charged to provide services. It's not immune from the undercurrents of racism, and that's what we need to remember. We need to be mindful of the impact on the families that we serve. So many of these families function in contexts that typify historically oppressive structural systems related to their specific membership in minority populations and living in impoverished communities. In particular, Black and Latinx people experience many inequities inherent in this racism and oppression as they navigate a host of human service organizations, medical settings, educational settings, justice settings. Minority child welfare impacted families are subject to implicit biases regarding their cultural and situational based parenting behaviors. I'm using the term impacted because, again, I was told by my respondents in my studies that they feel that they would prefer not to be considered child welfare involved because their involvement is not necessarily voluntary. They prefer to be referred to as impacted. So that's the language that I'm going to use to honor their perceptions. For instance, Black youths are more likely to be deemed in need of services despite their white counterparts exhibiting comparable presenting situations. And this played out a number of times in my interviews, and I'm going to get to the qualitative part a little bit later in the presentation. But I will note here that in my career, I started out as a purely quantitative researcher, much like Dr. Drake, and then I moved on to mixed methods because I was realizing that I wasn't getting the answers that I needed, and I needed to complement the quantitative work with some mixed methods efforts and approaches. So given these factors haven't yet been disentangled, these biases and how this plays out from specific decision-making points in child welfare involvement, it's really vital to validate the experiences of oppression and discrimination and racism among the people that are impacted by services. Structural racism, as I've said, is definitely inherent in child welfare systems, and families suffer a wide variety of socio-emotional and psychological traumas while they cope with the constant and profound fear of the dire consequences of which you all know, ultimately having their children removed and termination of parental rights. This ongoing trauma continues without a way to escape discriminatory practices and the racial biases that are displayed by all of us who have the power and authority to totally disrupt their families. There's near constant oversight and inspection wherein parental behaviors are regularly questioned, and parents are well aware of this from the moment of the very first investigation. So I'm positing the notion that the very minute a report is made, a judgment has been made. More often than not, We ignore the implicit biases in these assessments, and the system-based approach is accusatorial in nature and based on possibly misunderstood parenting practices despite what parents' intentions are. Okay, so experiencing poverty and racism is it's unintentional, and the consequences of such experiences should not be blamed on parents trying to raise their children to the best of their abilities and resources. I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that says, yes, I intend to be in poverty and I intend to experience racism and I'm totally okay with that. That's just not a thing. So parents' behavioral intentions should be considered, and we often don't do that, but they are a function of their available resources and their histories of structural discrimination and in environmental contexts. So perhaps we could designate far fewer children as neglected, whose families are in turn subjected to stigmatizing CPS oversight. We know that the bulk of our families are experiencing child welfare services because they have some form of, they've been deemed neglected in some way, shape, or form. This is directly related to, we all know this, and this is gonna be a theme throughout both of our presentations, I think, is poverty. So these behaviors related to poverty and oppression should not be necessarily considered maltreatment with the idea that this maltreatment is intentional or on purpose. And we really need to consider severe policy revisions to mandate a non-judgmental approach from the beginning and throughout the course of all child welfare involvement. Racial bias awareness at the point of screening in cases to investigate. This is very important, it's imperative. It should include ways in which to hold people accountable for not constantly assessing how their biases are impacting their decisions about the lives of these kids and parents, including the notion to place them on the roles of child welfare oversight, which is also a risk factor for further involvement. So what I'm suggesting overall is a renewed effort to support and empower parents and decrease punitive oversight. So what we should consider, this is a silly question. Why are Black people more likely to be poor in America? I know it's a silly question, but we have to think about that. And then after we do a deep dive in thinking about that, we have to decide whether or not we're just going to accept this and move on to the numbers, or whether or not we're going to go back to the etiology of the question. Why are they more likely to be poor in America? I'm going to put forth this notion of racialized poverty. It's important, in my opinion, to include qualitative accounts of how the quantitative data are associated with the lived experiences of Black people and poor people. The notion will be put forth that science is settled on the fact that poverty is powerfully associated with maltreatment. But what I'm positing is that first, poverty is associated with racism, which then leads to maltreatment reports. So there's a positive relationship between being Black and being poor. If poor children are reported more often, it's likely because their minorities are more likely poor. Poor people, poor kids may not be reported more often according to the data, but Black kids are. And we know Black kids are more likely poor in certain parts of our country. We need to think deeply about the etiology and the precipitating factors that result in disparate surveillance and reporting exposure. Moreover, it's been documented that poor kids are more likely to be involved with child welfare system. We all know this, but we want to address the disparities. But in order to do so, we should first be concerned about why the Black kids are more likely to be in these economic conditions, which lead them to being subjected to surveillance and oversight. So there's a definite link, but I don't think that we've done enough to tease out what that looks like and how to address it at the front end before reports are even made, like from a societal perspective in communities. So I've got a little chart that shows my ideas about options that drive racial disproportionality. We've been debating this, we're going to be continuing to unpack this for years to come, but we need to really add historical, structural, and systemic racism as a primary component. So if you could consider racism as the driver of concentrated poverty, then racial disproportionality comes about. So I put forth these two pathways for consideration with an emphasis on the first societal ill, which is racism. So we have racism and racial bias, which leads to poverty, and then leads to risk, which then ends up being reported. And another pathway could be racism and racial bias, which leads to poverty, which then puts people in a condition where in environments wherein they are being surveilled, heavily surveilled, which again leads to reporting. The reason I inserted neglect was to remind us that on any given day, over 3/4 of maltreated kids are neglected alone without co-occurrence. And so neglect, we know, is already directly related to economic hardship. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this concept of racialized poverty needs to be thought about a little bit more deeply. Poverty, particularly extreme poverty, is actually a form of trauma, and it results in a host of deleterious outcomes such as poor functioning, suboptimal behavioral choices. And these risk factors that result in increased child welfare oversight are generally outside the control of parents, primarily due to their positionality in society. So sadly, resulting in a much higher likelihood of initial child welfare oversight and surveillance. There's been tons of research documenting the relationship between poverty and maltreatment. A sampling of articles I've noted at the end of my presentation. Dr. Drake has really led the charge on all of this, so he is truly the expert on this because he's done the most work on this and teased out a lot. I'm just trying to add context that would complement his findings. So we have some conflicting results, some noting that after controlling for poverty or other socioeconomic measures, that race ends up not being a significant exploratory factor. And then there's other research that has noted the opposite, that even after adjusting for socioeconomic measures, that race remains significant as an explanatory variable. So this begs the question of the influence of bias. If both risk and income are held constant and race emerges as a significant predictor, in my mind, bias seems to be at play. Okay, so here I'm going to talk a little bit about the risk and bias models. So research has put forth two prominent perspectives. We have the bias model and the risk model. They're essentially competing.
Dr. Merritt, I'm sorry, can I just to quickly interrupt, would it be possible for you to move your papers a little bit away from your computer mic? When you're turning pages, we're hearing some.
Got it.
Yeah, we just want to make sure people can hear all your words and not the page turning. Thanks so much.
That out. I was trying to be present in the square, but okay.
It's hard. It's hard. I appreciate it. Sorry for interrupting.
No worries at all. So the bias model suggests that racial bias stems from those who report and investigate maltreatment, and this ultimately results in the overrepresentation of Blacks and other minorities in child welfare. So this overrepresentation is not a true indication, according to this model, that minorities mistreat their children more often, and certainly not to the extent noted by the disproportionality rates. A negative outcome in my mind of this model is that professionals and community members may end up pathologizing and labeling parenting behaviors by minority parents as abusive and neglectful, which ultimately reflects explicit or implicit racial biases in all decision-making processes. The risk model, on the other hand, suggests that Blacks and other minority groups do in fact maltreat their children at higher rates than others, but this is due to a number of personal and community level risk factors, such as challenges like unemployment, poverty. These are associated with inadequate risk supports and resources, diminished service access. So if such troubles were eradicated, one could expect both a decrease in parenting stress and also reduce that maltreatment risk. Both models have amazing evidentiary support and a wide body of literature, but yet the literature has acknowledged the risk model more often to explain this disproportionality. I'm suggesting that both models are at play, and they vary widely according to nuanced circumstances. Racial bias plays a role in the ways in which child welfare services makes and executes these programmatic decisions, and this is structurally supported bias. It creates a true risk of maltreatment. So the judgment from mandating referring authorities and those investigating the maltreatment allegations, it actually serves to increase stress levels among all the family members. A host of studies have shown that race significantly impacts these decisions among professional reporters at the front end of initial referral. I don't have time to get into what the differences might look like according to mandated reporters, but we know that close to 20% of all reports come from professionals, particularly the teachers in the education system, which is problematic, which is a different topic altogether. So I conducted a few pilot studies. I neglected to say that one of the reasons why I got into this work is because during my experiences as a practitioner in the field, I was noting that moms and children were not having their voices included in any of the assessments, certainly not the research, and it wasn't making it to the literature. And I felt like we needed to do a better job as a social worker by trade and training to empower them and make sure that their lived experiences of receiving child welfare oversight services were captured and acknowledged so we could understand the true impact. So these qualitative accounts come from some of my studies of and mostly Black and Latina moms are the bulk of my sample. And they perceived racial bias in their interactions with the child welfare professionals. Parents overwhelmingly reported feeling judged, disrespected, misunderstood. And so these are the next two slides. I'm going to share some accounts that speak both to race and poverty in the context of child welfare involvement. So this slide shares Bianca, her stories, and she's communicating a concern that she felt judged based on a stereotype that parents of color are bad. Generally speaking, there's a stigma associated with child welfare service involvement, but it's even more pronounced for Black and Latinx families with open ACS cases. And then we have a similar sentiment in response from Olivia. So I'll just read it. I don't know. I just think if you're a minority and if you have an ACS case, they have a certain perception of you. It's like a stereotype. If you already have an ACS case, they think in your mind, you're all are the worst type of parent. And then, so this speaks to the title of my talk, which was Black people catching ACS cases. And then Olivia, she's replied saying, nope, they don't give a damn. Skin means a whole light. If I was light enough, if I was white enough, bright enough, they'd be a little nicer to me because I'm dark. The word was said that I look aggressive. This is how I talk. I can calm this how I talk, but this comes across as aggressive. So she's speaking to this concept and idea that I mentioned earlier about colorism. It really comes down to that in some cases. And also there's a lot of tone policing around cultural ways in which people communicate, particularly when they're under stress. And there can be some incendiary terminology applied to them. And we need to be mindful of this because it's harmful. It's harmful. It creates more harm as our families interact with caseworkers and social workers and anybody who's making a decision about whether or not there's been some neglect or abuse within the home. So as we've discussed, a large proportion of families interact with CWS have low socioeconomic status. So this plays a huge role in their ability to parent effectively, particularly given the majority of the children are deemed to be neglected of sustenance or other basic necessity provisions. Suitable childcare settings is a huge problem. And so people just don't have the financial supports that are critical to sufficient or even optimal parenting. So responding to the question, do you make parenting decisions or discipline your kids based on your income? Carla says, a 33-year-old African-American mom with a young daughter age 7, she worries about providing basic necessities. So she says, I don't worry about being a parent. Like my biggest worry, if I did worry, it would be just to be able to provide basically, just providing for them, giving them what they deserve. They need to provide basic sustenance, and this was challenging to my participants. She shares the perils of living in a low-resource community and her worry about ensuring that the children in her neighborhood were able to access the needed resources and things that they needed to have beyond their necessities. Because what we should be striving for is not just to make sure kids have what and families have what they need just to survive. I would like to see an explicit intention to make sure we give parents and children what they need to flourish and thrive. That's really, really important. So just prompts for thought. This spoke to me. I don't remember where I found it, but this spoke to me. If you came with no preconceptions about the purpose of child welfare system, you would have to conclude that it is an institution designed to monitor, regulate, and punish poor families of color. And essentially, we are monitoring and regulating and ultimately punishing poor families of color. The oversight, surveillance, and the policing is profound, and it comes with other experiences that these types of families have had in other settings, in the communities in which they live, if the communities are heavily policed, in low-resourced school settings where there's a lot of oversight. So we just need to consider that as a notion as you do your work. I'm going to talk a little bit about just some other thought prompts that were brought to my attention as I was preparing for this presentation. So I'll start from the beginning. We need to understand and remember always, the vast majority of child maltreatment cases are due to neglect. So we have to consider, what are we really protecting children from? Are we protecting children from poverty? I don't think so. Or are we addressing low resource families once they are engaged in oversight services? Surveillance, I consider to be a risk factor for child welfare involvement, surveillance of all kinds. So how can we accurately identify serious problems with little to no acknowledgement of racist and oppressive contexts in which people live? We haven't considered the best path to mitigating this trauma of initial contact, which is a risk factor, as I've noted, for ongoing contact. So approaching assessments from a strength-based lens of evaluating out requires thorough investigations in the context of these societal ills that ultimately result in child welfare contact in the first place. Obviously, we're going to separate out from this conversation the most egregious abuse cases, physical abuse. I'm primarily talking about child neglect. So consider also whether or not formal child welfare service involvement has truly helped. So what's better, inclusive and unfounded dispositions out of an abundance of caution to avoid the onset of trauma, or the trauma of ongoing oversight? Furthermore, for whom are the appropriate formal services provided and under what circumstances? If formal involvement with child welfare has been deemed better than informal involvement, then wouldn't we expect the reduction of numbers of children formally involved to demonstrate success? But instead, we have a continuation of accumulated trauma the more people are involved and go through all of the processes of the system. I don't have the answers to all these questions. I'm just posing them as things for us all to think about and be mindful of as we move forward with our work. So to answer the question that was posed to me, why is the pressure to divert families from systems penetration necessarily a goal? Again, we need to consider the trauma involved in any penetration of child welfare services. Well-intended processes designed to divert system involvement are not at all leaving some large group of abused or neglected kids invisible. Neglected children are not invisible to the system. We need to be careful not to minimize the nature and the severity of the impact of neglect, including the impact of oversight from a systemically racist by design organization, despite all good intentions to protect kids. And this is very important to me. Again, we need to remember we just can't disentangle neglect from race or poverty. The threshold can't be disentangled. Appropriate child protection from physical and sexual abuse requires a much different approach from protection from racialized poverty and accompanied consequences. And I just wanted to point out that the ACE study is very useful for a lot of reasons. But again, we need more nuanced scales and indicators of how trauma is impacting families. It's not nuanced enough. It's also rooted in racism. And we need to think about also what we mean when we say minimally adequate care, because it definitely refers to financial well-being. And what was CWS designed to do anyway? Was CWS designed to address poverty or harm from abuse? Which one? Because it's been completely conflated. And under what context is adequate care evaluated? And I'll go back to the notion I just posited on the last slide, that do we just want adequate or do we want better than adequate for kids? How do we do that? So we need to figure out how we mitigate, we meet the needs of families once they're involved with child welfare services. Okay, so just tell everybody you talk to, there's no such thing as racially blind or neutral. It's just not a thing. So then what do? We start with a clear understanding of what we're here for. Where are we protecting children from? What problem are we as social workers and all the other ways in which we touch children and families in need, what are we actually protecting kids from? So what the problem is what we need to address. Then we need to figure out who or what is to blame for the problem. I'm positing that systemic racism for the bulk of our history is to be blamed for the problem. And out of that history, we have developed systems that perpetuate the systemic racism. And that's very problematic. So we need to think specifically about how racism plays a role in our assessments and our evaluations of these problems, and figure out what families are trying to heal and recover from before creating more things for them to need healing from. So these considerations should guide all the assessments at the front door before any engagement with families. We really need to think about what large-scale policy change is needed so that we could change the culture of the system such that first and foremost, a needs assessment and accompanying referrals is conducted rather than a surveillance plan from a blaming and a deficit lens. And this is for my colleague, Dr. Drake. Please don't throw out the idea of racism out with the bathwater of big data. I just don't think that we can continue to move forward with this notion that everything can be put into objective terms. In these situations, I find it hard for us to be objective in parental behavioral assessments. I also don't think that's a thing. I'm more concerned about unnecessary harm that's being caused. Having child abuse reports, child maltreatment reports are traumatic. Substantiations are even more traumatic. So I think that we should celebrate decreasing the percentage of Black kids moving through the system, which is good, to foster care and the termination of parental rights as compared to white families. But we also need to be very mindful, more intentionally about the front end. The bias appears when a Black person shows up in the room, and then poverty is secondary, and it's also confirmatory in the assessments of risk. And that is my thought prompt talk. And I've listed here some resources for you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merritt. And for all of you, we're going to make these slides available on the Child Abuse Prevention Council website after the speaker series is over. And I think we'll turn it over now to Dr. Drake. And you're muted, Dr. Drake.
Okay.
There we go.
Yay. Okay. I just got a note saying my internet connection is unstable. I've never seen that note before. Hopefully that won't be a problem.
Yep, we're hearing you great now, and we're seeing kind of a blank screen. We don't see your presentation yet, but you're definitely sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm almost there. How's that look?
You may want to reshare your screen. Oh, there we go. Now we can see it. Perfect. Thanks so much.
So first of all, I'm gonna throw some kind of caveats at you. I guess before I do that, I'm going to tell you I'm Brett Drake. I've been a professor in Washington University for a while. Before that, I was also in California. I was born in San Diego, and I was a CPS worker in San Diego for 3 years in the 1980s. So the caveats, I think, have to do with what you're going to hear from both of us, because a lot of what you're going to hear from us is identical. If there are two words I would like you to remember from my presentation, those words would be racialized poverty, which is something that Dr. Merritt talked about. So there's a lot of ways in which we fundamentally agree. I don't think anyone believes the CPS system is free of racial bias. I think that a lot of what we have to say is the same, but we're also using different approaches. I'm using kind of a 30,000-foot view. It might be a little more cold and a little more sterile. I think Dr. Merritt's using more of a kind of an across the tabletop view. And I think the other thing that is kind of exciting about my opportunity to talk here after Dr. Merritt is that I think her work is extremely consistent with the whole body of scientists doing the work she's doing in the way she's doing it. And I think the work I'm doing is consistent with another group of scientists doing the research in the way I'm doing it. So if you may be tempted to think that she and I are disagreeing with each other, I don't think that's true at all. I think you're getting an insight into different answers that are being found in our field depending on how you look for those answers. So let me go there and give you my presentation here. But before I talk about what I'm going to talk about, we're going to go somewhere else. Okay, let's say you run a lead abatement service in St. Louis, and half the people you serve are Black. Someone says to you, "Is that right? Is that correct?" And so you get on your phone and you Google St. Louis and you find that 50% of the people are Black. So you say, "Yeah, we're good. Half the people I serve are Black, and half the people in my service area are Black. I'm happy." But if you were to look closely, you might see something like this. This is a map of blood lead levels in St. Louis City. And so blue is good. You want to be in the blue area, and red is bad, and you don't want to be in the red area. Now, many of you have already figured out where I'm going here. You know, less lead, more lead, and of course, like almost everything in America, you get this. Again, it's not random luck. It's current and historical racism. You've got Black areas with high lead levels, and you've got white areas with low lead levels. So you're not doing well. Black people are way more likely to need your help, but you're not more likely to serve them. So you've actually got a problem. You thought you were doing okay, but you weren't. Because equitable service delivery is proportionate to need. And so in order to understand who we're serving and whether we're serving the right people or not, we need to understand who we should be serving. Okay, so we're going to talk about what we're supposed to be talking about. And we're going to go New York on you here. So this is going to Dr. Merritt's town here. This is a book that was very influential, written about 20 years ago by a brilliant and very courageous woman who I admire tremendously, Dorothy Roberts. In fact, if you're saying, "Well, Brad, I don't want to hear about 20 years ago," well, there's a symposium that's centered around this book happening in Columbia. So this is not old news. But it's also new news because recently this has become a very powerful political issue. So you saw a similar slide in the last presentation. And this is not a little thing that's only noticed by those of us who are in child welfare. This is quite a thing going on these days. And there's been stuff written about it. And you'll hear a lot that Black children are disproportionately over-surveilled, over-involved, over-substantiated, over-placed. And the interesting thing, I think, that's really been more of a thing frankly, since George Floyd, is that you're seeing people using the term abolish more. Now, I don't really know what this means, because some of these people seem to be saying, just get rid of it. And some of these people seem to be saying, no, we don't want to get rid of it when we say abolish. What we mean is abolish it as it is, something much better. So I've heard different things in terms of what that abolish term means. And this actually article just came out last month. And I'm actually going to let you read this because I think it illustrates how much concern there is right now, and how much this is a current policy, political, human issue. Okay. So are they right? How do we do that? Okay, so there are lots of ways we could look at this question. I'm going to use the term black box. This is not some inappropriate reference to black race. This, by black box, I mean in the scientific sense. I mean a thing that it's hard to look inside of and understand. So I'm not going to try to look inside it and understand it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to understand the child welfare system by looking at what comes into it and what comes out of it. So I'm going to avoid doing the kind of impressive and rather hard work that Dr. Merritt was doing. Instead of getting into the issue per se, I'm going to get a 30,000-foot view and say, well, what's happening in terms of who moves in and who moves out, and can that tell us anything? So that's what I'm doing. And I'm using big data. So in the United States, the child welfare reports, believe it or not, go into a central data repository. It's not publicly available, but if you're a researcher, you can get access. And there's an annual report you can read. If you haven't read this, you should. There's also a foster care big data set and an annual report, which you can read. And if you haven't, you should. And they include pretty much everyone who's reported to the system. So the numbers I'm going to be giving you are everyone. Okay, I'm not really looking at one mystery box or black box. I'm looking at three: who gets reported, who gets substantiated, who goes to foster care, and who gets their parental rights terminated. So I'm pretty confident about the last three boxes, but the first box, frankly, I can only give you partial information, and I'm going to do my level best to give you information so you can make up your own mind. But once we get through the first part, it's going to be a lot more straightforward. So here's the hard one. What did I do? I downloaded the child abuse and neglect reports for the whole country from 2018. I downloaded census data, and I created disparity ratios. So what's a disparity ratio? Okay, let's say that you're hiking the Appalachian Trail, and you find that 30 out of 1,000 people who hike the Appalachian Trail in Vermont get Lyme disease, but only 10 out of 1,000 people who hike the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia get Lyme disease. So that's a 3-to-1 difference. So that's what I mean by a disparity ratio. So the Vermont versus West Virginia's 3-to-1. Now, if you flipped it around, of course, it'd be 1-to-3, right? So it depends on which way you're going. So these are the numbers. These are the national numbers for 2018. I did not impute these. I did not use statistical witchcraft to come up with these. You can download these numbers yourself. These are just the numbers. Okay, and there's your first answer. If you're a black kid, you are 72%, 1.72 times as likely to have a child abuse report that is accepted for investigation, not screened out, as a white kid. So that's almost twice as much, and that's a big difference. That's easy. And that's not arguable, it's just true. But the question is, what does it mean? It could mean black kids are unfairly overreported because I think if 1 in 100 black kids are reported, it should be 1 in 100 white kids. So if you're looking at it that way, black children are definitely overreported. Or you might be in the middle there. You might say, you know, black kids get a pretty bad deal in America, and I would expect, since they're living rougher lives, that you might see more maltreatment. So maybe that number sounds about right. Or you might say, you know, I think we're giving black families such a hard time that I'm surprised that number isn't even higher. So you might look at this a number of different ways. Sorry, last detour. So as Darcey told you, sorry, we know each other, I'm sorry. As Dr. Merritt told you, poverty is associated with child abuse and neglect. Now, back when I was young, people didn't believe this, but now I think pretty much everyone believes that being poor is rough and poor kids are more at risk. You can look at this slide in more detail later if you want to, but I don't think we're talking about over-reporting just because of poverty. Okay, so is it reasonable that Black children are reported per person 72% more than white children, or is that a cause for alarm, or is that where it should be? So how do we figure that out? And the quick answer is, I don't know. But I'm going to show you what I think is one way to think about it. And this is not me telling you what the truth is. This is an invitation. I've got some numbers. I'm going to show you the numbers, and I want you to think about those numbers the way you want to think about them and interpret them the way you want to interpret them. Okay, what are these things? Now we're going to come back to the gray bars later. Right now we're going to talk about the black bars. So these are the relative risks, the extra risk of having these things happen to you if you are African American or Black, or if you are Hispanic or Latinx. So later no prenatal care in the Black population is about twice as often going to happen. Same with low birth weight, preterm birth, all this stuff. And in the Latinx population, the numbers are actually pretty close to 1. In other words, they're about the same as for white people, all the way up and down the line, except for this one. This one's kind of an outlier. Not quite sure what's going on there. So we can overlay the rate at which Black children are reported to Child Protective Services, 72% more often, and we can compare it to these other objective indicators of child well-being. Now, I use the word objective, and that's not a word scientists like to use a lot, because our whole training is to be careful about claiming that something is objectively true, because it's always hard to measure things. But these 4 measures here are probably about as close to an objective measure as you're going to get. Those things are probably not biased numbers. This could be biased because you may not have a correct account. These could certainly be biased because you might determine that a death is avoidable for one family and not for another family. But these are the most objective comparison points I know how to come up with. And so what we're seeing is that Black children are coming to the attention of Child Protective Services at a less disparate rate than they're experiencing these risks to their well-being. Now, these data are not perfect, and I'm not telling you to draw any particular conclusion. For one thing, most of these indicators, certainly all of these, are for very young children. Now, these indicators do get into older children, but I think they're a little more suspect. So what does that prove? You might say, it doesn't matter. I don't think it's fair. I don't like the comparison points. They're not okay. Great. You might say, well, how can Black kids be overreported to CPS when their risk of coming to the attention of CPS is actually lower than their risk of having these other negative child well-being outcomes? Or you might say something else. So that was the red box, and I'm not going to tell you I have an answer to that one. I do know that Black children are reported 72% more often, but I think we all have to interpret for ourselves if that's an appropriate number. The rest of this I can do easy. This is simple. It is simply true that per child, Black children are a little bit, hardly any, basically the same, but a little bit less likely to be substantiated once their case enters the system. So what we just saw before this slide was how likely are you to enter the system? What these slides are about is once you're in the system, what happens to you? Black children are a little bit less likely to be substantiated compared to white kids, but I don't know that 11% is enough to get excited about. They're a little bit less likely to enter foster care. Again, very close to 1. They're a little less likely to have their parental rights terminated according to the foster care data. That one's not pretty. They stay 25% longer. That means that if your average white kid were to stay, say, 4 months, your average Black kid were to stay like 5 months. That number scares me, and I think that's something we need to pay attention to. That's not a number we want to see. So now I can give you the slide again that I showed you before, but I can give you some numbers. Okay, now you might say, well, Brett, you're just wrong. You're one guy. I don't believe that they go through the system a little less than other people. I don't trust you. Well, you're welcome not to trust me, but you also have to not trust these other people. So far as I know, the studies that have looked at child maltreatment and have controlled for socioeconomic status tend to find that Black and white children are reported at relatively similar rates. Often Black children are reported a little less often. And the studies find that as you move through the system, Black children tend to go through a little less or about the same. And these studies have been done in California, in Pennsylvania, nationally, all different places. So what have I told you? Black children definitely come in more than white kids, 1 for 1, but it's lower than found using objective measures of well-being. And once in the system, they don't look very different. Emphasis here on the word little, a little less often. But once in foster care, they do stay longer, which is a problem. So what's my opinion? Dr. Merritt had almost the same slide. Again, if you remember 2 words from my presentation, I'd like you to remember racialized poverty. 5 miles from my house, there's a zip code, 63106. The median family income in 63106 is $15,000 a year. Family income, $15,000 a year. That zip code is 96% Black. This is not random. Okay, so the question is where the racism is. And again, Dr. Merritt had a slide maybe not too different from this one. It could be because Black people are much poorer than white people, or it could be that CPS is racist. Now, from a 30,000-foot view, not from an across the tabletop view, but from a 30,000-foot view, it looks like poverty is the thing that's showing up in that aerial photograph. So it could be that the real problem is the outrageous economic differences between races. If this is true, I think we all need to kind of jump on the various bandwagons these days that are trying to help poor people. I was extremely heartened by some of the new president's attempts to reduce child poverty. It is like the coolest thing I've ever seen in politics in my whole freaking life. I was very, 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 very happy. So I think that as long as there's a woman in 63106 making $15,000 a year who's crying because she can't buy a backpack for her child, I think as long as that's happening, we got terrible, terrible, terrible problems. So for me, that's something I see that we need to work with. I'm also all about getting into the inside the black box in CPS and seeing stuff we can work with. And the more detailed we can be, the more actionable that is, and the faster we can move forward. Again, I think it's all, well, no, I don't think it's all about the money. I think it's often and largely about the money. And I really want us to make progress on that front. I definitely don't think it's all about it. So that's all I wanted to say to you, but I wanted to confess to committing a crime that a lot of people like me create. And that is that when we say we're talking about race and ethnicity and child welfare, we talk mostly just about the white-black thing. And there are more Latinx than Black children in America, and I think we often ignore them in our research, and I think that's a disservice. So I just wanted to back up a little bit and give you something here about that population. You see basically the same effect. You see that the rate at which Latino children reported to CPS is a little less than white children, but a lot of their risks are either very close to white children or a little less than white children. So again, the numbers kind of line up. Now, you may be saying, Brett, what's going on? Why are those gray bars so far over to the left compared to the black bars? Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you that 10 or 15 years ago when I started finding this, I didn't have any clue. If I had read the medical literature, I would have known that what I was seeing is something called the healthy immigrant effect, or the Latino paradox, or the Hispanic paradox. If you look at almost any perinatal outcomes or any maternal or child outcomes, you will see that Latinx kids do much better than you would expect. So this finding is not just a child abuse and neglect finding. This is a finding that's consistent and is a well-established thing out there. So like Dr. Merritt, I've included for you some references I thought you might enjoy that you can look up. And I want to leave some time for questions. So I'll turn it back to our moderators.
Yeah, I think we'll start with questions from Steve Barron, and then also I've been getting some questions both in the Q&A and in other ways. So when we're done with the questions that Steve has for the two of you, I'll turn to some questions from the group. And then if you're in the group and you have questions that either the answers to these questions provoke or that you've been thinking about the presentation so far, please put them in the Q&A now. All right, Steve, go right ahead.
Okay, first of all, I think you already discussed, both of you, a lot of the areas that you agree on, especially the problematic impact of poverty and its association with racism. But this is a question I have for each of you. What are some of each of your most important specific recommendations, if you have them, for the child welfare system? And either one of you can start.
Oh, I'm unmuted, so I'll start. Material supports, material supports, material supports, material supports. In the last 5 years, there has been an explosion of excellent studies showing that the people we serve need material help. Rent assistance, utility assistance, money, just money, anything we can do to help these people to have the chance to have a semi-dignified life. It's hard to feel like you're living a dignified life when you're deeply impoverished. Anything we can do along those lines is going to help. And like I said, I didn't know this empirically 5 years ago, but my reading of the literature is any way you can get into the cold hard cash game, or the material support game, or the voucher game, or whatever you can do, that's going to help. And so I'm very excited about that. And for once in my life, it looks like the politicians are actually on the same page as the scientists on that. And so, thank God. So that's my point of view.
Dr. Merritt?
Once again, I'm not going to disagree with Dr. Drake. So the American Rescue Act, absolutely a game changer for a whole bunch of people and poverty, lifting folks out of poverty. So yeah, people need to be able to, as you mentioned, buy a backpack. People, I mean, some of the accounts I've heard from my respondents is people are catching ACS cases because they didn't take their child to school because the child didn't have her hair done, and mom couldn't afford to get her hair done on that day that they were supposed to go to school. So it's all about what supports people have to thrive and flourish, as we said. But to complement that, I don't think that we can get away with continuing to not address systemic racism within the community and as it's inherent in the system and how that plays out, and implicit biases amongst the people who are investigating, the people who are reporting. I mean, we have mandated reporters, teachers, and there's a bigger stick than there is a carrot if they don't report every little thing. And they have implicit biases that come into play with regard to, well, this doesn't look right. I better report this. The minute that report is made, that family's done. So
I hear there a recommendation for more training for reporters and system participants on the specific issue of implicit bias. Do you have any other specific recommendations for social workers investigating and dealing with child protection cases? You're muted.
Sorry, this is a little bit parallel.
Okay.
One of the mistakes I made the most when I was a CPS worker is I would get tunnel visioned into the issue that was reported. And I think, I know now from looking at the numbers I look at, that the next time that family has a problem, it could very well be a different problem. And so when I was a worker, I did a terrible job of looking broadly enough at the family. I was too locked into whatever the allegation was. So that's advice I would give myself if I could go back in time.
And
Dr.
so
Merritt?
what I would do, I would be the opposite, because I looked at the whole context. I was like, well, what's happening? Oh, there was a murder on the corner last night. Oh, I understand why you're a little bit stressed. So I look at the whole context as much as possible. But I feel like we need to revisit the categories, all of the different categories. For instance, failure to provide has been checked when child didn't go to mandated counseling at school, that mom and dad had no power over getting child that counseling. So we have all these categories that are willy-nilly being checked and not always appropriate or accurate.
And this is true for physical and sexual abuse too. Sexual abuse may happen because you don't have anywhere safe that you can have your child be because of financial issues. Physical abuse can be because of stress associated with financial issues. So this is a very broad, outrageously important issue. Transportation. We had so many families kind of start to circle the drain when their car broke down, because then they can't get to the things they need to do to comply with court orders. They can't do all kinds of other things. It's just, you got to look at them like they're your relative, not like they're your case. If this were my nephew, what would I have to do to make my nephew have a better life? Not what am I supposed to do as a caseworker?
Absolutely. I completely agree. And that's
James, questions from the attendees?
Yeah, we've gotten a few, and I'm going to start with, we'll start with one that was just asked relatively recently. So both you have talked about racialized poverty in different ways, and about how money solutions might be helpful in addressing disproportionality in a child welfare system. But one of our attendees asks if we're living in a society that has racist systems and racist people in it, would monetary supports actually be changing the way the child welfare system works, or would it really just move the racism to a different part of what we're talking about?
monetary assistance would not hurt anything.
Right.
Let's start there. It wouldn't hurt anything. And given we've already, both of us have connected poverty with racism and surveillance, if monetary assistance was there, that family might not be in an environment where there is heavy surveillance and oversight and a lot of reporting going on. That family might escape some initial supports because of what the monetary assistance has done to help reduce those risk factors.
An oppressed person who can afford a lawyer is in better shape than an oppressed person who can't.
All right. Well, here's a question that I think is related to some questions that people are having around the country about making reports to police. And it's about people making reports to CPS, either as a mandated reporter or not. And wondering about whether the act of reporting a case to CPS is, in some instances, inviting something that's punitive or not, and how the services that can flow from that are balanced out in this question. I think it's I'm trying to ask the question in the clearest possible way. I think it's a hard question to ask and a hard thing to think about it. Hopefully you get what I'm trying to ask.
I can share from and then I'll just jump in, because I've had this conversation with some of my respondents and clinicians who I've interviewed, who have said it's sad that parents don't get the financial and tangible supports they need until they're involved in CPS or child welfare services. And that's problematic. It's really problematic that we don't look at them, we don't help them before they get there. And with regard to police reports, yes, as I've said earlier, I think the minute a call gets made is the minute the trauma begins. So we all as a society need to figure out how to interpret or assign meaning to people's economic conditions and their societal conditions. But we need to do more about giving people supports before. If you're not going to get any supports or services until you're under surveillance, that's punitive. That's problematic for me.
How do you think that interrelates? Because I think this was part of the question that I didn't ask, and it's an important part. How do you think that interrelates with mandated reporting laws in California and other places?
Brett, do you want to go? I just think the mandated reporter laws should be revised, but so I'll let.
Well, there's two ways to look at this. You can look at it like it's parent accusation services and family trauma services, or you can look at it like it's child protective services. So the other side of the coin are dead kids. And if you're doing something that limits your ability to protect children, that's a trade-off. So you've got to balance. I mean, more kids die of maltreatment than die of childhood cancer. Okay, so can you get the eyes on and the services out that you need to do as well if you change the system? And if you can't, you need to be concerned that maybe you're falling back on the ability to protect kids. Remember, these are the kids most vulnerable to death are kids under 2 years old, and they're super important. And so, you don't want to be going out and doing something that's unproductive and traumatic for no reason, clearly bad. You don't want to be leaving kids who might die unaddressed, clearly bad. So that's an incredibly complicated question, but I think we need to think about both sides of the question.
One of the things that you've talked about is trying where we can to think about the kids we're serving in the system as if they were related to us, as if they were our nephew, for example, I think is a way you've thought about it. I think that one of our attendees is also trying to think about how we can continue to do this work with compassion and empathy, and also not be so personally involved in each individual case that we're not able to do this work anymore. So I wondered if you might talk about issues of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or other kinds of terms that I know you're familiar with, and how that relates to the way that we want to make sure that we're showing the most empathy and compassion for kids we're serving.
I'm not really, okay, I was an LCSW, but I think I'm an expert in that area. My only comment would be try and be as present and real and human in the situation as you can. And I'm sorry, I just don't have much else beyond that.
I would say that we need to push back on the notion that when we show up to be helpers, social workers, practitioners, nurses, whoever, we don't necessarily need to check ourselves at the door. You don't, in fact, you shouldn't check yourself at the door. You should come in as a human and display humanity. And that in itself might be a little bit healing as you're doing the work with the clients. And yes, self-care is imperative. People will have vicarious trauma, but if you display in the process of your developing a relationship with that family, then it's healing for both people. The family feels less judged, feels more like you're helping as opposed to judging and just waiting to like drop the hammer down on them. That's what I would suggest.
Processing people is painful for everybody. Having a real human experience with someone, that I'm all about that.
One of the things that's in place in lots of places in California and the United States is true here in our county. We've got a organization that provides volunteer child advocates for kids in the dependency court system and other ways, foster care. And do you know of any research that talks about whether the involvement of a child advocate, a volunteer child advocate from a nonprofit, affects any of these outcomes or helps the outcomes for children more broadly?
I don't know of any research, but I have recently this spring I've conducted 2 or 3 workshops for those such people in New York, lawyers actually, and workers that go into the courts and advocate for parents who are just on the brink of having their parental rights terminated. And this organization that I've presented to, they asked myself and my colleague to come and give them a training about how to have these conversations with parents, how to interact with both the lawyers, the judge, while at the same time holding and containing the parent who's in great stress and just their lives are about to turn upside down. So again, it goes back to this training. How do you have these conversations? Understanding your positionality. Okay, I'm a Black person. I'm going to have a different conversation with a Black client than I do with a white client. When I go to interview my parents who are primarily Black and Latinx, it's still, I don't speak the language. I don't look the part. I have to be very mindful when I walk into these low-income housing complexes about how that's going to play a role in my ability to even develop a relationship and collect my data. So it's very nuanced, but we just need to be mindful of who we are and who we're talking to.
Yeah. One of the questions that we got very early in your presentation, and I don't want to forget, so I'm going to jump to it now because it's easy for me to get distracted by the most recently asked question, has to do about a movement I know you're familiar with for medical clinics around the country to be no-hit zones within the medical clinic. And the question was, do you think that there are issues of disparity or inequity in this movement or this project about no-hit zones, either specific to medical clinics or more broadly?
You mean like no corporal punishment?
Yeah, I think that's, I think I'll just say that the medical clinics are wanting to make sure that kids are not hit in the waiting room or other places by another kid, by an adult, by anyone. And so are trying to make the medical clinics no hit zones. And also states like California say that corporal punishment is when reasonably done is legal in the state of California. And I guess the questioner is asking, well, I guess since you're academics, I'll ask it this way: is there research that you know about disparities or inequity in projects like this?
Let me comment before you get a chance to respond. The no-hit zone is basically aimed at training the staff when they see that happening to go up to the parent and basically say, see the sign? Can't hit a kid here. It's really rough being a parent. Can I give you some information that might be helpful to you? And that's pretty much it. Go ahead.
I mean, obviously an agency can do whatever it wants to do, and the law about whether it's child abuse or not is the law about whether it's child abuse or not. You do see regional variations in terms of the endorsement of corporal punishment, and differences by religious affiliation, some small differences by race, and some large differences by class. But no, I'm not quite sure how to respond apart from that.
Yeah, I'm unclear as well. I know that there are a lot of organizations that are making explicit statements against corporal punishment, but I haven't heard that this no-hit zone approach is being implemented in the agencies and the medical settings here in New York. It could be, I don't know. Hitting is bad.
We don't have evidence the corporal punishment is as effective as other forms of parental guidance. We have clear evidence that other forms of parental guidance are more effective. But there are also consumer level advocates who will say things like, in my community, there are such extreme dangers that I have to prevent from getting to my child, that I have to use very forceful discipline with my child in order to keep my child safe. So there are some people saying things like that too.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Brett, because I've found that with my research as well. Like some of my parents, not necessarily hitting them, but they've had pushback on not doing certain like happy-go-lucky privileged parenting because they live in really scary neighborhoods. And so they can't let the child go play on the quad to get fresh air and green space. First of all, there's no green space. Secondly, there's used needles in the park on the quad, and someone got shot the other day. So, you know, the parents have to think about their context, environmental and neighborhood context, and maybe raise their child with, to have a demeanor that would protect them more forcefully outside. That happens. And I call it a protective sort of parenting rather than the opposite.
One of the things that both of you have touched on is, well, the whole talk has been about the impact of race in the system. What do you think about the impact of racial differences between the people providing the services versus the clients for those services? So in a county like Santa Clara, where we have lots of different DFCS employees of lots of different races and ethnicities, and also lots of different kids of different races and ethnicities, you're going to have a caseload, and you're going to be serving families that are of lots of different racial and ethnicities, and some of those will not be your own. What kind of research has been done into that, and what thoughts do you have about that work?
So I'll go. I think people need to, as I said earlier, people need to be mindful of the differences as you approach families. And that requires self-reflection. That requires ongoing assessments of your implicit biases. It needs to be a daily, lifelong, ongoing thing with just not working with the people you work with, but everybody out on the street, the person at the grocery market. As far as what the research says, I can't point to specific studies because I'm not deeply involved in that particular research inquiry, but I would imagine it would say what I'm saying is we need to be mindful. I have had results from my qualitative studies where I've noticed some internalized depression and racism with one family. I have an outlier, one family that says a Black family that says she doesn't want Black mentors for her children, and that I see as internalized racism and oppression because she sees the white workers as more who she wants her child to emulate, and so she prefers not to have the Black people, practitioners, come into the home. So, but for the most part, most of the Black families that I've interviewed have said that they prefer someone that can at least understand their experience in a similar skin.
Right. I looked at this literature a few years ago, and what Dr. Merritt said is exactly right. There is some difference in terms of preference. In terms of outcomes, we've had a much harder time finding that kids look different based on the race of their caregiver. I would also stress, by the way, that if I were going to be doing any kind of sensitivity work, I would emphasize class, because teaching master students, number one cluelessness among my students is often around class. You've got people who have grown up in very nice trajectories, and it's just, it's cringeworthy, you know, what happens when they're exposed to really poor people.
There's been a lot of training, I know, in our county and other places on implicit biases. Do I take it from your answer, Dr. Drake, that you would be advocating for training on implicit biases, not just with relation to race, but also with class, or am I interpreting that in some other way?
I'm in favor of any training that can be shown to have a positive effect in the field. So for me, I'm very much into this evidence-based practice thing. And so for me, I would be hesitant to support any training unless there's empirical evidence that it changes what happens on the ground. Not that it changes what people say they think about themselves, but I want to see, if I'm going to pay for an intervention, I want to see that when stuff happens on the ground, that's going to be different. And I know that's a high bar, but I think we owe it to our clients to hold ourselves accountable to how we train people, that we know how it affects what happens on the ground.
I see you're nodding your head, Dr. Merritt. Are there specific trainings that you would recommend that are more effective on the ground?
Well, there are many that are floating around now because, as you know, in the last year, everybody woke up and figured out that this thing called racism was like more profound than we originally thought. And so there's a lot of initiatives right now and implicit bias training. But again, it becomes problematic if it's not at my school. The word mandated is a dirty word. So it becomes problematic if we can't strongly encourage with incentives people to attend this training and be engaged. You can lead someone to water, but you can't make them drink it. So people will sit through a training and then go out and do the same thing because it is hard work. So I think that training is imperative, but there are many new trainings that are coming about now at the university level, in child welfare field, with police, with teachers. It's imperative.
No, I think that's a great answer, and it's a great question. We're getting to the end of our time with the two of you. I really want to thank both of you on behalf of the Child Abuse Prevention Council. This has just been an amazing discussion and amazing presentations. It's been really helpful, I think, for our whole community, and I really want to thank you so much for being part of it. Steve, do you want to have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to express my tremendous appreciation to both Dr. Merritt and Dr. Drake for participating. I think this has been very enlightening for a lot of us in our community, and I just really appreciate your contribution to trying to do the best we can for the children and families in our community. So thanks.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks. That was a lot of fun. Thank you.
See, and we're on the same page, right?
Of course.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll come right back with our next two presenters in about 10 minutes. So thank you so much.